Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I'm doing a video that I'm very excited for because I've been planning this video for over a year now. And also I'm excited because it is talking about two of my favorite things, which are The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater and personality. So if you watch my videos, you probably know that The Raven Cycle is one of my favorite series of all time. It's some of my favorite characters, but you may or may not know that I love personality. It's something that that's been a passion of mine for over 10 years now. I have studied personality in school. I have done trainings for it. I read lots of books about personality. I talk about it like incessantly. So personality is something that I really love. So a lot of times when I start reading books, I try to type the characters that I'm reading about, which I know a lot of people who love both books and personality do this also. But it's something that I think is really fun. So I thought it would be really fun to make a video talking about what personality types I think these characters are. To keep this video from being incredibly long, I decided to focus on just one type of personality assessment, which in this case is going to be the Enneagram. And I picked it for a couple of reasons. One is that I know that this is a personality assessment that has recently become more popular in the booktube community. So maybe people will be more familiar with it and really enjoy it. But I also feel like this one lends itself really well to analyzing characters because the basis of the Enneagram kind of focuses around on what is each type's greatest fear, their greatest desire, and then how do they cope with those two things. And those are also really the basics that you need to know about any good character. So I think that these two will pair really well together. I'm going to do a really quick rundown of the 9 types with just a little bit of information. So if you don't really know anything about the Enneagram, then you'll have at least a basis of knowledge, but I'm also going to link below some resources, so if you want more detailed information, you can go there. That's also going to kind of be like my references page, and so most of the information that I'm going to be talking about in this book will come from the things that I'm going to be linking below. So I'm going to be doing a really quick rundown, and then I'm going to go more in depth into the types when I talk about characters that are those types. But also, I'm by no means an expert in the Enneagram. This is not one that I have any particular training or anything in. I just have read a lot of books about it and I really enjoy it, and I think it's really interesting. So I'm going to explain everything to the best of my ability, and of course it's all going to be from my own understanding of the Enneagram and these characters. I could be very wrong as to what types these characters are. Also, they're fictional characters, so there's really no way of knowing what types they are. But I would love to hear from you guys. If you have opinions about what types these characters are, you can talk to me in the comments. I'd love to talk to you guys about these characters and their personality types, whether you agree or disagree. I'd love to hear about it. This will probably have some spoilers for the whole Raven Cycle, because I am going to be talking about things that happened in the Raven Cycle that indicate certain personality traits. So, watch at your own discretion. So the order that I'm going to be going in is just, as I said, a crash course in the basics of the 9 types. Then I'm going to talk about the main characters and have the most in-depth analysis of the main characters, and then talk about some of these side characters that I may not have quite as much information, but just kind of what types I'm thinking those characters are. So let's start with what is the Enneagram. So the Enneagram is a personality assessment that has 9 types. It's most commonly used just for personal development, spiritual development, things like that. It's not really used in research or academic settings because it's not statistically validated, but a lot of people do find a lot of value in this system and a lot of wisdom in it that they can apply to their lives. So as I said, there are 9 types. They're set on a circle. There's this symbol that goes along with the Enneagram that I will put here. So it's a circle with this little star pattern in the middle. The reason for the star pattern is that each type has 2 lines. So there is one line that is their growth line. So when this type is growing, they're integrating, and it's kind of when they're being their best selves, they take on the positive traits of the type that they have aligned to. Then they also have a stress line. So when that type is under stress, they kind of regress and revert back to the negative elements of the type that they have aligned to. And I'm going to talk more about the lines later on. Something else to know about is that there are also wings, which pretty much just means that each type can be influenced by the types directly on either side of it. So a 4 can have a 3 wing or a 5 wing, and it can have some personality traits from either of those. So starting with type 1. Type 1 is often called the reformer or the perfectionist. Their greatest fear is that they are somehow corrupt or defective in some way, and their greatest desire is to be good and virtuous. The way that they do this is by always striving to be more perfect and by trying to make themselves beyond reproach. Type 2s are often called the helper or the giver, and this type, their greatest fear is that they are somehow unworthy or unlovable, and their greatest desire is to be loved. They are a very loving type and they want to be loved and appreciated, so the way that they do that is by offering nurturing and love to others as a way of getting love and affection in return. Type 3 is usually called the achiever. Their greatest fear is that they are worthless and that they have no worth outside of their achievements. Their greatest desire is to be worthwhile and valuable to others. So the way that they do this is by impressing other people through their success and their image of their success. Type 4 is often called the individualist. Their greatest fear is that they have no personal significance or that they are not unique. Their greatest desire is to find themselves and find their significance. So what they do is they try to find themselves so that they can fully express themselves as an individual and with authenticity. Type 5 is usually called the investigator or the observer. Their greatest fear is that they will not be competent or prepared for what life throws at them and they will be overwhelmed. So their greatest desire is to be competent and capable. The way that they do this is by gathering knowledge as a way of preparing themselves, but also as a way of creating a buffer between themselves and life so that they will not be overwhelmed by it. Type 6 is usually called the loyalist. Their greatest fear is that they will be out in the world without support or guidance, and their greatest desire is to feel safe, secure, and supported. So what they do is they are constantly scanning for threats and coming up with plans to help protect themselves and protect themselves really from their own fear. Type 7 is called the enthusiast. Their greatest fear is that they will be deprived or in pain and that they will be trapped in this feeling of unhappiness. So their greatest desire is to be content and feel satisfied. The way that they do this is by kind of always being on to the next exciting thing as a way of keeping their options open, to keep their freedom, and to keep themselves occupied so that they don't have to dwell on any feelings of unhappiness. Type 8 is called the challenger, and their greatest fear is of being harmed or controlled by others. So their greatest desire is to protect themselves and be in control of their own lives. So 8s seek to prove their strength, resist any weakness, and be in control of their environments. And finally, the last type is 9, which is often called the peacemaker or the mediator. Their greatest fear is of loss and separation, and their greatest desire is to feel at peace and to feel harmony. So 9s will often avoid conflict as a way of avoiding separation from others, and they forget their own needs and merge with the needs and desires of others. So that is kind of the bare minimum of what you would need to know about these types, and as I said, there's links below with much more detail. But now I want to dive into the characters, and I'm going to start with Blue because it all starts with Blue. And for Blue, I think that she is probably a type 4, which is called the individualist. They're the one that their fear is that they have no personal significance or they are not unique, and their desire is to find themselves and their personal significance. And I think this sounds a lot like Blue. She is constantly searching for herself, her significance, what makes her special. And I think that she is usually worrying that she's not as unique or interesting as she wants to be. She thinks that she's just too sensible, and she wants to be kind of quirkier than she thinks she is. She talks about how she has to cultivate a look, cultivate the aesthetic of being a quirky person in the way that she does her hair and the way she dresses, because she doesn't feel like she inherently has that unique element to her. But at the same time, Blue also feels like she is very different from everybody around her. She feels like she's very different from everyone she goes to school with. She even feels like she doesn't fit in with her own family. And this is something that a lot of 4s report, that they feel like they don't even fit in with their own families. They kind of will look at their family and go, go like, where did I even come from? I don't match these people. So 4s will often have this kind of dichotomy of the fear of not being unique, but also this deep feeling that they don't fit in and that they're kind of estranged from everyone around them. And I think Blue definitely has that same like conflict of feelings within her. 4s are often very creative, and Blue is definitely very creative as well. We know that she makes her own clothing or upcycles her own clothing. She likes to express herself, her individuality, and her creativity through her appearance, which is a very 4 trait. She also decorates her own room in really creative and unusual ways. And 4s like to surround themselves with beauty. They're very creative and aesthetic type. And so having a space that is beautiful and inspiration and kind of inspires them is really important to 4s. 4s also very highly value authenticity, since they are always looking to better understand themselves and express their own individuality. They also are trying to express their own authenticity. So they very much value that in themselves and in others. And Blue definitely values authenticity in herself. She is going to be herself and express herself as she sees fit. In the book, she says at one point, "I don't care to be pretty, I care to look on the outside how I feel on the inside," which again is a very 4-ish sentiment. Because 4s value authenticity so highly, they also really look for authenticity in others. And 4s can be really good at seeing through all of the layers of the masks that we may wear or the ways that we try to present ourselves. And they're very good at kind of honing in on that, what is your truest self, because they're so focused on true authenticity. 4s will often also really focus on the more negative or darker emotions because they feel like those are often the truest or most authentic versions of ourselves, or most authentic expression of how we feel. And there's one scene in, I think, the second book, and maybe it's the first or second book, when it is just Blue and Gandhi together in Gandhi's room, and Gandhi is really upset about something. He's lying on his bed and Blue is looking down at him and thinks, this is the true Gandhi, because you're seeing his distress and that's the truest thing about him. And she also thinks to herself, this is my favorite Gandhi. And that is again a very 4 sentiment, that the darker emotions is the truest form of self, and also because she feels it is the most authentic, that is her favorite expression of self, and that's her favorite version of Gandhi to see. So I mentioned before that each type has a growth line and a stress line, and for a 4 they have a growth line to 1 and a stress line to 2. So when a type 4 is under stress and they have the stress line to 2, they will take on the negative aspects of 2 and become more self-sacrificing. Then when 4s are in growth, they have a growth line to 1s, and so they take on positive elements of the 1, which means that they become more principled and focused on justice, and they can kind of get focused more outwardly, because 4 tends to be a very inward focused type, so they can become focused more outwardly. And I think that Blue probably has a good growth line to 1 because she is focused on justice. She is very principled in a lot of ways. She has a lot of causes that she cares very passionately about, so I think that that makes sense for her as well. Something else I wanted to talk about is that there's this other theory that is called Tritypes, and this is one that's got like kind of controversial within the Enneagram. Some people don't think it's like a legitimate theory for the Enneagram, but I think it's interesting, so I wanted to talk about it. So what a tritype is that in the Enneagram, the 9 types are categorized into 3 groups. There are the heart types, which are 2, 3, and 4, the head types, which are 5, 6, and 7, and the body types, which are 8, 9, and 1. And so we usually have our dominant type that is in one of these intelligence centers, but as humans, we are not just a heart or just a mind or just a body. And so what a tritype does is that you kind of take the type that you identify with most from each of the 3 categories, one from each, and put it together to make a more fully well-rounded type. So I just kind of want to talk about the tritypes that I think each of these characters are. And for Blue, I think that she would be a 4, 8, 6. So 4 is her heart type, 8 would be her body type, and 6 would be the head type. So we just talked about 4. 8 is the challenger, and 8s can be a very intense personality. They want to assert their own power and control over themselves or others. Now, since it's part of her tritype, it may not be as noticeable in her personality, but Blue is definitely a force to be reckoned with. They talk about that, like, she's a very short person, but she takes up more like energetic space than her body actually does. She's someone who refuses to be pushed around. She will stand her ground and she will not let people take advantage of her. So I think that she has some elements of 8 in her personality. And then I think the 6 is probably the thing that brings in that feeling of being very sensible, because 6s are very like diligent workers. They're very responsible, and they can have some kind of anxiety about their safety and the world, and so they tend to be very responsible and focused more on concerns of the world that would make her be more sensible than the other people around her. So next I want to talk about Gandhi. So Gandhi is actually one that I kind of go back and forth about what type he is. So this is one that I would especially love to hear if you guys have any opinions about which type you think he is. I'm going to talk about the 2 that I go back and forth between, which are the 3 and the 9. So the 3 is called the achiever. This is the one that their greatest fear is that they have no worth other than their achievements, and their greatest desire is to be valuable and worthwhile to others. Now, I don't know if these fears and desires exactly sound like Gandhi. That's one thing that I kind of go back and forth about, but there are a lot of other things about the 3 that definitely sounds like him. So 3s really focus on having this image of success. They tend to be very poised and likable. What 3s often do to appear more successful is they chameleon to the environment that they are in and the people that they are with. And they'll talk about very often about wearing masks, that there are different versions of themselves, which is something that is very true for Gandhi. Now for 3s, they are in the heart center, and so they're actually very good at reading people, and the way that they use that is by reading what is going to be the most successful kind of archetype of a person in the eyes of whoever it is that they're speaking with, and then they can adapt to that and kind of put on that mask so that they will have this image of success. And this sounds in a lot of ways very much like Gandhi. There are a lot of times where they talk about that there are different versions of Gandhi and how he can just slip in and out of these different versions of himself based on who he's talking to. And this is very similar to the different masks that the 3 can wear. Something that comes along with this shifting of masks, though, is also the fear that no one truly knows the 3. A lot of 3s will have the fear that under the mask, that there's nothing, that there's no core to themselves under this mask, that if there's no one for them to kind of reflect or mirror back this image of success, that they don't know who they are at their core without that. And there can also very easily come this feeling that nobody truly knows the true version of the 3 because they chameleon so easily to whoever is around them. And I think that that is a fear that Gandhi definitely has, is that very often he feels like people don't know who he truly is, and he fears that people only love him for this veneer that he has created and not for who he truly is. For 3s, a common defense mechanism that they will use is identification. And what this means is that they will find somebody or something that they see as the model of success, what success truly means or what success truly looks like, and then they identify with that thing and they try to model themselves after it as a way of creating that image of success. And this sounds like Gandhi's relationship to Glendower, that he has chosen Glendower as this image of success, this model of success. He is this great king. And Gandhi talks about how Glendower is like everything he wants to be, and he very much identifies with Glendower and tries to model himself after that. As a 3, Gandhi would be able to have either a 2-wing or a 4-wing. So a 2-wing would bring in more of a caretaking element to the three, which Gandhi definitely has. He's kind of the mom friend of the group. He has a caretaker element to him. I always just imagine his relationship to Adam as that meme of the guy running after somebody just yelling, "Let me love you!" So that would make sense for him a lot. And then he could also have a four-wing, and the four-wing can also make a lot of sense for Gandhi because he definitely is very aesthetic. He has a certain look that he is going for, and he definitely curates his environment. He has some very quirky and unusual interests, and he has this kind of romanticism to him, especially that he loves, you know, Glendower and this mythology around it. So I think that he could definitely have some influence from a four-wing. Now, I also feel like sometimes Gandhi might be a 9. So the 9 is called the Peacemaker, and their greatest fear is of loss and separation, and their greatest desire is to feel at peace and have harmony. I think that this fear sounds a lot more like Gandhi because I think that he is very much afraid of loss and separation from the people that matter to him. So in order to avoid loss and separation, 9s avoid conflict. And I think that Gandhi is definitely a very conflict avoidant person. He doesn't really engage in conflict. He either just kind of, you know, avoids it completely, or he'll tell people like, I don't want to fight with you, I don't want to do this. There are really only 2 times that I can think of that Gandhi at all engaged in conflict. One is in, I think, the last book, when Ronan is saying how, you know, what he does in his dreams is nobody else's business, and Gandhi tells Ronan, like, no, because of what happens in your dreams, Jesse Ditley is dead, and you can't say that what happens in your dreams doesn't affect other people. And that was something that really surprised me, that I was like, oh wow, like usually Gandhi is way more passive aggressive than this. But that kind of shows that his bar for like what is worth getting riled up about is like death. If someone died, that's the thing that's like worth conflict. Anything before that, conflict is not really worth it. The only other thing that really causes conflict with him is when he fights with Adam. And I think a lot of that is because Gandhi wants to be closer to Adam, he wants to help him, and he wants to like merge more, and Adam very much wants more independence, and it does not allow Gandhi to like merge with him in that way. And so I think a lot of what fuels Gandhi's side of the fight is his fear of separation and of loss of that important relationship. And 9s can be very supportive types, and a lot of times can be mistyped as 2s because they are also very supportive. So he could get kind of that mom friend element from being a 9 as well. Now, 9s also can chameleon to their situations and to other people, but they do it kind of in a different way, and they do it for different reasons. Now, 9s do it not to impress people, but to merge with them. So 9s will take on the desires and needs of other people, forgetting their own, as a way of creating greater harmony between themselves and other people. And I think that in some ways this sounds a lot more like Gandhi, because I always got the feeling that when he changes his behavior, I feel like it's not because he's trying to impress people. I always got the impression that it was more as a way of comforting other people, that they have a certain expectation or image of who Gandhi is and what he's supposed to act like, and he's just kind of meeting that expectation as a way of avoiding any dissonance. And I've heard in like interviews with 9s saying that if they grow up in an environment that has very particular standards of how someone's supposed to behave, even if those behaviors are counter to how the 9 would naturally behave, 9s will take on those behaviors as a way of merging with their community and those expectations. And I think that Gandhi did in a lot of ways grow up in an environment that has a very particular standard of who he's supposed to be and how he is supposed to act as a Gandhi. In order to merge with other people's needs and desires, 9s can be very self-forgetting. This means that they are not always the most self-aware because they have to suppress or avoid or forget their own needs and desires in order to merge. It can also mean that sometimes they feel like they're not very present in their own lives, and that is something that Gandhi mentions, that there is one scene, I think in The Raven King, where he says, oh, this is what it's like to be present in my own life, which indicates that in a lot of times in his life, he feels like he is not present in his own life. And then, as I said, 9s, they will often forget their own needs or desires, and so they will often assume that, like, since my own needs and desires aren't important to me, they're not important to other people either. So they often feel like they are not important people or not important to other people. And I think that there's one scene that especially stuck out to me in that regard, which was towards the end of The Raven King, when Gandhi kind of goes off on his own and he goes to that cave to find Glendower, and then his friends all show up. They all find him to help him, and he's so surprised that they cared enough to show up. And that just seemed like such a 9 moment, to assume that, like, in his mind, like, this is his thing that matters to him, his thing that he has to do, but 9s often will devalue their own desires, so they assume that other people will also. And he was so surprised that he was important enough to his friends that they would care to come and find him. Then in terms of wings, I don't really see him having an 8 wing, but he could potentially have a 1 wing. A 1 would kind of give him this, like, desire to be good, and also 1s would encourage having, like, high standards and kind of be more motivating, because 9s can sometimes have trouble getting themselves motivated. So if he had a 1 wing, that could kind of help him be more motivated. In terms of lines, I especially wanted to look at the stress lines for the 3 and 9. So for the 3, they have a stress line to 9. So maybe he is a 3 and the 9-ish elements that I see in him just come from being under stress and kind of incorporating elements of the 9 in that way. But when a 3 goes to 9, they often become more apathetic, they can lose motivation, and they kind of want to blend in more, which is usually counter to how 3s often are. Then when 9s are under stress, 9s have a stress line to 6, which means that they become more anxious and they have more of this, like, batten down the hatches, like, let's hunker down and kind of become more protective. And it can be kind of paralyzing to 9s. Both 3s and 9s can often suppress their true selves to chameleon to situations, but they very deeply want their true selves to be affirmed and loved. So they really highly value people who do that, who are able to see the true self of the 3 or the 9. And I think this is one of the things that Gandhi really loves about Blue, because she is a 4 and she is so focused on the authentic true self. She's kind of one of the only ones who's really able to see through the different masks and the different versions to who he truly is underneath. I think that Gandhi's tritype would be a 3-9-5 or a 9-3-5, either way. But we talked about both the 3 and the 9. So 3 would be his heart type, 9 would be the body type, and then 5 would be the head type. And so 5 is the thinker, observer, investigator type. 5 is a type that is often kind of in their own head and can get lost in their inner world or lost in their work and their most recent obsession. And they are a type that is very focused on wanting to truly understand something, whether it's their environment or something that they are really fascinated by. And I think that definitely sounds like Gandhi. All right, so now we're on to Ronan, and Ronan, I think, is probably one of the most obvious of all of them, because Ronan is probably an 8, which is the challenger. So the 8, their greatest fear is of being controlled or hurt by other people, and their greatest desire is to be in control of themselves and protect themselves. A lot of 8s will report at some point in their childhood that there's this moment where they lost their innocence, some life-changing moment that made them grow up too fast. And for Ronan, that would probably be when his father dies and he finds his father's body. And from this experience of something that makes them lose their innocence, 8s then decide that they have to learn how to protect themselves. They have to be somebody who is strong to protect themselves, and they have to prove their strength. But because of this, they can also be really protective of other people, because they know how terrible it is to feel weak or vulnerable or be taken advantage of, and they don't want that to happen to other people. So 8s can be really justice focused, and they can be really protective of the people that matter to them. And that definitely sounds like Ronan Ronin, 8s are a type who will, for the people that they care about, they will put it all on the line. They will just throw themselves into situations to protect others. And Ronin is like that as well. He doesn't always have the best self-preservation instincts. Sometimes he's a little too willing to throw himself at something to protect others, but he definitely has that highly protective instinct and the desire to assert his strength and his dominance in his environment. Along with being really protective of other people, 8s also really respect people who are able to stand up to them, because 8s can be very domineering and intense personalities, and they really respect people who can match them intensity for intensity, or people who will not back down and won't be intimidated by their intensity. And I think we get to see that with Ronin's relationship to Blue, because she is somebody that the beginning of their relationship is kind of rocky, but Blue is somebody who will stand her ground. She will not be intimidated, she will not be pushed around, and over time Ronin really respects her for that, and that's one of the things I think that makes him feel like, oh, we could be friends, like you can actually be a part of my life, because he respects that element of her, that she will not be intimidated or pushed around by him. But as I said, 8s are very intense people. They have like big energy to them. No matter what size they are physically, even if they're very small physically, they have this large aura that you can like feel when an 8 walks into a room, because they just have this energy to them. And that's often, Ronin is described as somebody who has this aura around him and has this big energy that you can just feel, or they describe him as having, like, you can just feel the anger rolling off of him. And then 8s are further drawn to intensity. They're drawn to intense situations. They're very often drawn to conflict, because conflict creates these highly intense situations. They're drawn to intense sensations and just really anything that is kind of the most intense version of whatever it is. And again, Ronin loves things that are high intensity experiences. He loves to drive fast cars. He loves to listen to loud music. 8s also really value authenticity, kind of like 4s. They want to be able to show up fully. They want to bring their full selves to every situation. They pride themselves on being somebody who does not sugarcoat things. They will just say it like it is. They will be totally honest, and they hate lies. And again, that sounds very much like Ronin. He hates lies, and he always says that he does not lie. Because 8s can be these really intense personalities, they often fear that they're going to be too much for people and that they're going to push people away because of that. But they don't dial themselves down, because again, they want to be their full authentic selves. So instead what they do is they try to push people away to see if they're going to be too much for somebody. So they'll often kind of needle at people and push at people and see if this is going to be the thing that's too much. Is this going to be the thing that like pushes you away? And it's a way of just like testing people, because they would rather know sooner rather than later if you're going to be intimidated by them, if you're going to be overwhelmed by them, and are you going to abandon them? So this is also a way that they build intimacy, because over time they'll see that somebody is not going to be pushed away by their like needling and their intensity, so they feel more comfortable with that person over time. And we can definitely see this in Ronin. He does and says things to get reactions out of people. He says, he makes crude jokes, he yells at them, he does things to push people's buttons to see if they will, you know, leave him. Then for the 8's growth and stress lines, an 8's stress line goes to 5. So under stress, they will become more secretive and fearful, which I think sounds like Ronin, that when he is under stress and becomes more afraid of what's happening in his life with his dreams and everything, he tries to become more secretive and keep it more to himself. Then when 8's go to their growth line, they have a line to 2. So in addition to their protective instincts, they also get this level of warmth and caring and open-heartedness that kind of goes along with that protectiveness as well. And I think that this is something that we get to see from Ronin over the course of the series, because at the beginning he starts off very closed off and keeps a lot of secrets to himself, and then over the course of the series he really does open up a lot more and become much warmer towards the people that are important to him. We get to see glimpses of that caretaking in him as well, especially in regards to the barns, that there is this like softness to him and this desire to take care of others, that he takes such good care of all of the creatures of the barns. And for his tri-type, I think that he would be an 8-4-7. So the 8 we talked about, the 4 we talked about with blue, that it's that element of authenticity, but it also brings this kind of romanticism and imagination to him. And then the 7 is the enthusiast, and the 7 is the one who they're afraid of being trapped in this feeling of pain or unhappiness. And of the head types, I think that probably sounds the most similar to Ronan, that as a way of avoiding their pain, they look for experiences to keep their minds occupied. Now on to Adam, who is my favorite character. He's another one that I kind of go back and forth about which type he is, because I go back and forth between whether he is a 1 or a 6. I feel like maybe he's actually a 1, but I also feel like he's a 6. I'm going to talk about both of them and you can let me know which one you think he is. So the 1 is often called the reformer or the perfectionist. Their greatest fear is that they are somehow corrupt or defective in some way, and their greatest desire is to be good and virtuous. And I think that in some ways this does sound like Adam. I think that he does fear being corrupt, and that he is somehow like inherently just wrong. A lot of his internal rhetoric is around like fear that people will be able to see that he is not good enough, which does somewhat sound like a 1 kind of fear. 1s have very strong inner critics, and Adam definitely has a very intense inner critic as well. 1s set very high standards for themselves, which Adam definitely does, and they talk about how Adam always wants to be the best. He's always striving to be the best, especially academically. 1s also highly value independence like Adam does, and 1s are in the body center, so what they want most is independence, but the way that 1s get it is through compliance. So they comply to rules and standards, which I think is the way that Adam kind of operates, is that he wants his independence, and the way that he's going to do that is by following the rules. 1s are very self-controlled and self-contained as a type, and Adam definitely keeps himself very much under control, and especially his anger. As a type in the body center, anger is a very intense emotion for 1s, but they try very much to suppress it because they often feel like they shouldn't be feeling angry. But Adam does, especially towards the beginning, have some anger issues. Of course, some of his anger is justified, but there are also times like a moment when he and Blue are in his apartment, and he I think kicks a box or his nightstand or something, and he doesn't even really remember or register that he did that. He just kind of lashes out because usually his anger is so under lock and key, but there are kind of moments where it bursts out. For a 1 though, I do feel like the wings for 1 don't really make sense for him. They would either be 2, which is the helper giver, or 9, which is the peacemaker mediator, and I don't really feel like either of those fit him, but I do think that the lines make pretty good sense. So the stress line for a 1 would be to 4, and so when they go to 4, 1s can often get more lost in daydreams and fantasy. They also get start to feel alienation, and they can also kind of get lost in envy and resentment. Now, I don't think that he really gets lost in fantasies and daydreams so much, but he definitely does feel alienated. He repeats over and over to himself, "I am unknowable," which really sounds like something a 4 would say. And then he also definitely has feelings of envy and resentment. The growth line for a 1 though goes to 7, and so when they go to 7, 1s can become more spontaneous, more lighthearted, optimistic, and like just let go of a little bit of that intense self-control. Now, if Adam was a 6, the 6s are often called the loyalist. Their greatest fear is that they will be out in the world with no support or guidance, and their greatest desire is to feel safe, secure, and supported. 6s tend to feel like the world is a dangerous and uncertain place. They learn from an early age that you really can't trust people, especially authority figures. A lot of 6s will report sometime in their childhood that they either had an abusive parent or they had a neglectful parent. Of course, it can be in varying degrees depending on people's lives, but those are just common patterns within sixes' pasts. And I think that definitely sounds like Adam, that he does have, that his father is abusive and that his mother is then kind of neglectful of him. So he has both of those. And because of this childhood experience, they learn that people cannot be trusted, and especially authority figures cannot be trusted. And because of this, sixes will become hypervigilant and suspicious, that they are always scanning for threats. They look for what are people's other motives. They look for like what's the worst case scenario. They create contingency plans. And Adam is a very suspicious person. It's said many times that he's very suspicious of people. He knows that Gandhi often thinks that he's too suspicious. Blue mentions that she knows like that Adam does not trust anybody. So it's reiterated many times throughout the books that he's very suspicious, he's very untrusting, and that he does not begrudge anybody else their suspicions, because in his mind, if he was a six, he'd be like, yes, if you are suspicious, that is an accurate way of seeing the world because it is dangerous. Now, because sixes are always scanning for threats and trying to forecast and figure out like what could go wrong, they have this really interesting mix of being both very analytical and very imaginative, because they're imaginative because they're imagining all of the possibilities of what could potentially go wrong, and then as part of the head center, they analyze all of those possibilities. And this combination of imaginativeness and analysis creates somebody who's very intuitive, which I think sounds like Adam as well. He is very good at making judgment calls. He's very good at figuring out what is going on with all of the crazy like magic stuff that's happening around them. He's able to pull in so much information and so many small cues from his environment and then analyze them and engage his imagination as to like where could this be going or what could be going wrong. And he just is able to really understand what's happening in a way that the other characters can't, even though obviously none of them have any previous experience with a magical dream forest. And because of this, Gandhi really trusts Adam's judgment, but Adam doesn't really trust his own judgment. And that is something that can happen a lot of times for sixes, that they are very intuitive and imaginative and analytical and all of these things, and they can be really good at, you know, forecasting and all of that. But because they have so much fear or anxiety, they may not trust their own judgment. And there are times when Adam says that when he's by himself, he feels like he can't even make decisions on his own without the rest of the gang there, because he doesn't really trust his own decisions, even though everyone else knows that he has really good judgment and he can be trusted. Now, for sixes, there's a defense mechanism that I wanted to talk about, which is projecting, because I think that we see this in his relationship to Gandhi. A lot of times what sixes will do is if they have a fear, they will project that fear onto somebody else as a way of divorcing themselves from that uncomfortable feeling of the fear, because if it is outside of themselves, then it's something that's easier to deal with. And I think that's what a lot of the fights between him and Gandhi are about from Adam's side. So Adam has this fear that he's not good enough or that he is worthless, and he fears that other people also think that he is worthless, and because of that they want to control him, because they think he's not really worthwhile unto himself, so he should just be controlled. And he projects that onto Gandhi. He thinks that Gandhi views him as inferior. He thinks that Gandhi sees him just as another thing to be controlled. And of course, Gandhi doesn't actually see him that way. But as a way of protecting himself from his own fear of that, Adam projects it onto Gandhi, so it is something external to himself that he can protect himself from. Now, one thing about sixes that doesn't quite fit with Adam is that sixes tend to be very community oriented, and he is very like independent, just very wants to like do his own thing. He does have a support system, of course, within the gangsy, but it's still not as much as like usually sixes are considered very community oriented as a type. Now, one of the reasons that it took me so long to make this was because for a long time I thought that Adam might be a 3, because a lot of his fears are around being worthless and then thinking that he has to achieve things as a way of gaining worth, which sounds like the 3 fear. But I don't think that he's actually a 3 because he doesn't act like a 3. He doesn't have masks. But I think that what is happening is that we're always seeing him under stress in the Raven cycle. And for 6s, their stress line goes to 3. So they take on the negative elements of the 3. When they go to 3, they can become more image conscious, more afraid of like worthlessness. They become more focused on that their worth comes from achievements. And he's very much under stress throughout the whole of the Raven cycle, which I think is what was confusing me. And one of the reasons really that I think he's a 6 is because of this stress line. And then the growth line for the 6 would be to 9. And so when 6s go to their growth line, they can become more relaxed and be more willing to rest and be more optimistic, which I think also sounds, well, that sounds like what Adam needs. I don't know if we've ever seen him like that. Also, I think the wings for the 6 would make a lot of sense for him because he could have a 5 wing or a 7 wing. The 5 wing brings in that seeking of knowledge, wanting to understand, which sounds like Adam. And it could also lend more of that independence because 5s are very independent and kind of reclusive types. So that could kind of maybe make sense as to why he is so focused on independence. And then the 7 wing could also be that there are times when he is a little bit reckless and he is kind of playful. Usually those are when he's hanging out with Ronan, and Ronan kind of brings out that more playful side to Adam. So I think that Adam's tritype would be 6-1-3 or 1-6-3. So we've kind of talked about all of these, the 6 and the 1, and then of course the 3 is that focus on achievement, which of the heart types, I think that that's probably the one that sounds most like him. So now we're on to the characters that I just feel like I have a little bit less information about, so I won't be able to go quite as in depth. But first, of course, I want to talk about Noah. We can't forget him. And I think that Noah is probably a 7, at least when he was alive. It's kind of tough to type him as a ghost because they say even that he's not really his full self when he's a ghost. But from what we know of him from when he was alive, I think he sounds like a 7. One of his family members describes him as a firecracker who had a lot of energy and all these ideas. And I think that very much sounds like a 7. There's one scene when he pulls a lot of energy from Blue and kind of revives himself a little bit, and he gets really excited and is trying to pitch this idea to her of this thing called chicken out. And it sounds very 7-ish. 7s can be very fun-loving and high energy, very optimistic and enthusiastic. They're called the Enthusiast. So I feel like that kind of sounds like him. Then Henry, I think, is probably a 4. Now, it took me a little while to figure out what type Henry is, but the reason that I settled on 4 is really because of the way that he befriends Gandhi. Because when they go into that hole under the school, the way that Henry wants to make friends is by going, let's bond over trauma. And that seems like a very 4-ish thing to do. Again, looking for like authenticity in their relationships with others, they may focus on these darker, more negative emotions as a way of feeling closer and authentic. And that just sounds like Henry. 4s are also known for being dramatic sometimes, and I think we all know that Henry can be kind of a dramatic character. And then also, very much like Blue, Henry is able to kind of see the truth of Gandhi. There are 2 moments in The Raven King when Gandhi feels truly known and truly seen, because most of the time people just focus on the masks that he creates. And one of those times is with Blue, and one time is with Henry, because I think as 4s, they're the ones who are the best at really understanding what is the truest version of Gandhi at his core without all of the different versions of masks that he has created. Then for Kavinsky, I don't know what type he is. I didn't have a good feel for like what his personality was like. I just feel like whatever type he is, it's probably just a very deeply unhealthy version of whatever that type is. Because of course, all of these types have, you know, positive and negatives to them, and they also have more healthy and unhealthy versions of themselves. So you can kind of develop to a healthier or unhealthy version. So I just feel like Kavinsky, whatever he is, it is an extremely unhealthy version of whatever type he is. Now for the 300 Fox Way ladies, I think that Maura, Blue's mom, is probably also a 7, which is the enthusiast. She doesn't like to dwell on the past and negative things because 7s are usually kind of wanting to move forward and keep themselves occupied so they won't be trapped in a feeling of unhappiness. Also, in her parenting, she gives Blue a lot of freedom, and sometimes Blue wants more structure, but as an enthusiast, as a 7, 7s highly value freedom. And so in her parenting, I think she kind of gives Blue what Maura would want, is she gives her a lot of freedom. Then Persephone, I think, is kind of difficult to type because she very much keeps to herself and there's a lot of mystery around her. But because of that, I think she might be a 4, which is the individualist. They do tend to be more reserved types, and also she has this kind of aesthetic and mystique around herself that she has created, which again sounds like something, sounds very 4-esque, that they are a very aesthetic type, and then also would enjoy the drama of having like a mystique. I think that Kala is probably an 8, which is the challenger. She also has this like big energy, and they talk about how she kind of like can fill a room just with her energy. She often encourages Blue to be like more confrontational. And then also when she first meets the boys, so when the boys first come to 300 Fox Way and the first time that Kala and Ronan meet, they have this like weird standoff between them where they're kind of like staring each other down or sizing each other up or whatever it is, which can sometimes happen with 8s when they meet because both of them are these like big intense personalities who want to be in control of their environment, and they want to like, you know, prove they're the biggest, baddest kid on the playground, and so they can kind of butt heads when 2 8s meet. I think Orla may also be an 8. She's probably an 8 with a 7 wing. She does kind of needle and poke at people in the way that 8s do. She kind of messes with Blue sometimes, but she does have this kind of lightheartedness to her, and she does have this attitude of like, oh, it's all just for fun. So I feel like she has probably a 7 wing. And then there's Jimmy, who I usually forget is even in the books because she's like barely even there. So from what I can tell, I feel like Jimmy is probably a 2, which is the helper or the giver. She's described as being very warm and loving and supportive. The one scene that she's like really in is one where she's taking care of Blue, and they kind of describe her as having this very like caregiver, like mothering kind of energy to her. And so that sounds probably like a 2. And then for Mr. Gray, I think that Mr. Gray is probably a 5, especially a 5 with a 4 wing. So the 5 is the investigator or the observer. They're the ones that kind of gather information as a way of protecting themselves from the world. They want to be highly competent and prepared. And they can also be very secretive. Now, this may be partially just because of what Mr. Gray's job is, but you know, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did he take the job because it matches his personality, or his personality changed because he has this job? But 5s do tend to be very secretive, and they keep a lot to themselves, and Mr. Gray is definitely very secretive. 5s also tend to compartmentalize a lot, and Mr. Gray, I think, even talks about that he compartmentalizes his life. And 5s also will often have these intense interests or hobbies because they love to gather information and knowledge, but they are also very secretive and compartmentalize a lot. So they kind of have different areas of their lives and don't share a lot of information. So they'll have these like really intense hobbies that nobody knows about. And in a lot of ways, I think that also sounds like Mr. Gray. He does have a hobby that he really loves, which is medieval poetry, and he only brings it up in like specific situations, but it's not something that he like just tells anybody about. And I think this is also part of why I think he has a 4 wing, because there is this like kind of romanticism to him that I think especially why his interest is something like medieval poetry. I think that romanticism could come from a 4 wing. And Blue's father, Artemis, is very difficult to type because he's barely in it, but I think he might be a 9. It's hard to say. The 9 is the Peacemaker, and my main reason for thinking this is pretty much just because he's very conflict avoidant, especially because in most situations he either like hides in their pantry when there's conflict, and 9s they're not only conflict avoidant, but they're also kind of passive aggressive. And so he just doesn't address it when he doesn't want to like deal with somebody, or he doesn't want to answer their questions. He either hides in the pantry or he becomes a tree, which I feel like is the ultimate ideal for the 9s, where it's just like, oh, conflict I don't want to deal with, let me just become a tree. Then for the Lynch family, I think that Ronan's mom, Aurora, is probably also a 9. Now, it's kind of tough to type her and Matthew also because they're dream things, and so they're not necessarily like a full expression of like a person. I kind of feel bad saying that though, because like they're both so wonderful, but yeah, so it's hard to really type them. Now, I think that she's a 9 because I think that she does not really assert her own needs. She very much goes along with everybody around her and what they want or need. And I mean, I think she was very much made that way. She was made to be that way because that's what Niall wanted in a partner. Well, he didn't really want a partner, but that's, you know, the ethics of creating Aurora is like not part of this. But she doesn't assert her own needs, and I think that she does merge with others. She takes on their desires and needs. But also there's this scene when the kids are in Cabeswater when Aurora is living there, and they talk about how with each of the kids, she like adapts herself to what they need and changes the way that she interacts with them and the way that she expresses love based on what they need. So she's merging with their needs and kind of giving them what they need and the way that they need to be loved. And so I feel like that sounds like a very 9-ish way of expressing love. Then Declan, I have no idea. That boy confuses me so much. I'm going between like 4 different types right now. I think he could be a 1, a 3, a 5, or a 6. I don't know. But I think that when the Dreamer trilogy is done, I probably will make another one of these videos talking about the characters from the Dreamer trilogy, and I'm hoping by then I'll have a better grasp on Declan's personality and be able to really type him. But at the moment, I have no idea what type Declan is. And then for Matthew, again, he's a dream thing, so it's really hard to say, but I think that he would probably be a 7, which is an enthusiast, because his most defining feature is just that like he's really happy all the time. He's just like a little ray of sunshine. And 7s, of course, are more than just happy all the time. Like nobody's happy all the time, and there's more to a 7 than just that. But 7s do like to stay optimistic and upbeat, and they want to be happy all the time. They want to avoid pain or unhappiness. So even though he's a dream thing, I think that 7 would probably be the closest to the type that Matthew would be. All right, so those are all of the types that I think these characters are. As I said before, there are lots of links below, so if you want more information, there will be links to websites and books and references and all of that. So if you want more information, you can look at all of those. I would love to hear from you guys what you think these characters' types are, from either what you know of the Enneagram or my explanations. I just love to talk to you more about this. Obviously, I love talking about these characters. I love talking about the Enneagram. So please tell me in the comments what you think of these characters. And also, please let me know if you enjoyed this video. You can either, of course, leave a comment, or if you just want to give the video a like. I would love to make more videos like this. This is something that I think is really fun. I really enjoyed, you know, analyzing these characters and doing all this research about the Enneagram. I had a really good time, and I already have some ideas for other popular series that I want to do this with, so I'd love to know if this is something that you guys want to see more of, and if you are interested in me doing more videos like this, because I'd love to make this a series on my channel. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far into the video, I'm sure this video will be incredibly long, so thank you for watching and sticking with me and listening to me talk about this thing that I really love. This is a lot of fun. But thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!